Before I begin, hello. I
Hello.
would like to say, hello to my dad who kept texting me, "Can you see me?" Hi. All right, so the title, The Barter of Human Flesh, was inspired by the notes of my favorite historian, Dr. Bertram Wallace Corn, and I say his full name because in every single thing he wrote, it was all three names, and I feel like I should do him that justice. Anyway, Dr. Corn graduated from HUC in 1943 and 49. He was a chaplain in World War II, the first Jewish chaplain, sorry, to receive a flag rank in the entire U.S. Armed Forces. So that's very interesting. He was author, as I said, historian, and not above, but as well as anything else, he is the reason I've been studying this topic since I was 19 years old, and I just fell in love with it. And although he has been dead for quite some time, I would be remiss if I did not thank him and the AJA for letting me read through his many, many notes that he's left behind. So Corn provides readers throughout his many works with descriptions of slavery, and they emphasize how Black people were sold and bought and traded, and how awful that is. And I was going to use a quote from my title, actually, and I decided to provide my own and add on to the research. And I would just like to tell you some of those things that he wrote. The merchandise of souls, the trafficking of souls, the barter of humans, which is what mine is based on, and my favorite, murky, troubled, painful subject. Next slide, please. All right.
Just leave it like this.
Trying.
It's mostly content that I'm speaking on anyway. So slaves first set foot in the Americas in the late 1500s. They were just passing through around Mexico, and there's a document saying like so-and-so passed through with their slaves on a ship, and they stayed for like a few days. The first permanent slaves to be brought to America and kept was in 1619 in colonial Jamestown, Virginia. It was specifically August 20th, 1619, when 20 and odd Angolans arrived. They'd previously been on a Portuguese slave ship, which was overtaken by an English slave ship and then brought to Jamestown. And the first Jews don't arrive until 1654. Also in the records, it can be confusing because although the first slaves arrived, or permanent slaves, in 1619, sometimes the records don't count American slavery until 1776 in the founding of America. So I've decided to start it where it truly began. Next slide. So Jews, like everyone else, like today, like throughout all time, wore many, many hats. They're doctors, politicians, farmers, etc. One of those hats were slave traders. There weren't an abundance of Jews in antebellum America, and an even smaller amount were slave traders. So slavery to these people wasn't really about morality. It wasn't really about if it was good or bad to most people. It was more about a way to make money. They thought that these people were merchandise. They didn't think these people were people. So they sold them just as they would sell like a towel. There is also an ad called White Slaves that was published in 1863. It signed a Democratic working man, so it's difficult, to tell who, but it's criticizing the Union for not using slaves because they're using white people and paying them when they could use these people who would work for free. It just seemed outlandish to some Southerners. So very few Southerners voiced their distaste for slavery, even fewer Jews, because a lot of Jews, the goal was to fit in with other people, to prove themselves to be true Americans. And so there was a woman named Eleanor Cohen, and after the war, she writes in her diary, she was one who did not have a distaste for slavery. And she said that she had become accustomed to being waited on by slaves, and she was uncomfortable with white servants because they didn't always obey, and she had to pay them. Next slide. So I'd like to give you two examples of how different Jews could be on their views of slavery. So Judah Toro, he was against slavery, but like many people, it would look kind of weird if you didn't buy them and you needed them. Like if you had a farm, it would be odd for that person to not buy slaves. So he would buy them with good intent. And he would, when he purchased them, he would either free them or set them up in business, which means he would pay them to work, or he would put them like work for other people, but he would give them money, which was most important. And my favorite thing he did, he bought a former slave named Ellen Wilson a house and gave her $4,000. And people were not very excited about him buying a house. And the way he got away with it was the house was in his name. He just let her live there. They tried to take it away, but because black people couldn't own property, but it was in his name and they couldn't do anything about it. Next. On the opposite spectrum, we have Benjamin Mordecai. Now this man was, like a lot of them in my thesis, hard to find because they tend to sign their names with just their initials. So he was involved in slaves, and he was very adamant about his love for the Confederacy. And he was the first person, not Jew, first person to donate to the Confederacy. $10,000 in 1861, which in 2024 is $354,922. He was located on 5 State Street in Charleston, which you can go and visit. Many of the Jewish slave traders were located quite near each other, Jews and Gentiles. Next slide. This is an ad from Benjamin Mordecai. As you can see, 5 State Street, prime field Negroes and house servants, auctioneer, private sales. So he was one of the smaller scale slave traders. This was the biggest sale he ever did. It was 37 slaves plus 3 children. They don't count as separately because they're sold with their mother. Fun fact, well, not fun, but children weren't sold separately until they were about 6 or 7 because that was when they deemed they could work. And oh yeah, these range from infant to 40 years old. Next one. I would be remiss if I did not talk about this man. He is so famous in Jewish slavery. He is a New York rabbi, and his sermon that I'm going to talk about is actually on exhibit. And it's a pre-1900 Fridays here at the Klau Library if you're interested. So he gave this sermon 3 months before the war in January. He said that he comes to the conclusion that slavery is condoned by the Bible. And since it is condoned, how dare we speak against it? So before Rafal's sermon, many rabbis steered away from bringing such topics into the pulpit. It's a very sensitive topic at the time, but after this speech, we see a large number of rabbis start to give speeches to prove that they disagree or agree with him. He defines a slave as a captive or a servant of some kind. The slave is a person. He has rights. And he decides that Black people don't have souls. And you need a soul to be a person. Therefore, Black people aren't people. Therefore, there is no slavery in America. So he didn't understand what the big problem was. Next slide. Yeah, how dare you denounce slaveholding as a sin? Oh yeah, he ends the speech by saying he doesn't wholly agree that Black people aren't people, but he does agree with them being beaten and enslaved as humans, which is worse to me. Actually, I don't know, but that's up to you to decide. A Hebrew journal, Hanachaj, backed this idea that Black people were not people, saying that they're not descendants of Abraham. They were created to serve in the Garden of Eden. Okay, next. All right, next we're going to talk about David Einhorn. I know you all know a lot about this man. I'm going to keep it just to slavery. He published 4 articles in his journal Sinai in opposition to Raphael's speech. April 9th, 1861, there was a riot in Baltimore. This is 3 days before the war breaks out. And he was chased out of town. Also, I feel like people don't remember Maryland and Delaware are border states. So this is, it's very north for a Confederate state, and the tensions can be high. Har Sinai, his congregation, invited him to return after the riot on the condition that he not speak of excitable issues at the time. He denied and never returned. Next. Max Lilienthal, a German rabbi of Cincinnati. He believed slavery was immoral, but that the South had the right to their own economic system, which was what they thought slavery was. And once the war broke out, he fully sided with the Union, which angered some of his Southern friends. Next slide. One of those Southern friends was Jacob Cohen, who was the 10th largest slave trader in Charleston at one time. The only Jew in that list, so the largest Jewish slave trader of that time in Charleston. And Lilienthal had sold lithographs of himself, and Cohen returned one and scratched across his face that he never wanted to see this man again and that he was very betrayed. But after the war, he flips a switch and says he's so shameful of his actions. So next, Isaac Leeser. He's noted for his indecisiveness during slavery, or regarding slavery. He attempted to avoid advocating for either, really. There's pro-slavery writings of Leeser's that survive, but he avoided making any political statements like public due to the strong sentiments on either side. And he was sent a death threat by a man who we only know as M.A. Dropsy, which the mayor assured him that he would be safe. Next. Oh, yes, my favorite. So Charleston, South Carolina was essentially a one-stop shop for slaves in the 1800s. It was all downtown. You could buy your slaves' clothing, you could sell them, you could buy them. It was just slave central. They actually had to shut down the main auction house because it was getting too busy at one point. I could go on forever about Charleston, South Carolina, but I need to mention one of the most memorable slave traders of the time, Abraham Mendes Satius. Although he died before the Civil War, I absolutely have to talk about this man. He owned a store. He sold many things, such as dried goods and slaves. And this is a one-of-a-kind ad in 1794. And if you've taken Dr. Zola's American Jewish History class, you know this. Abraham Satius, also gracious, once again does offer his service pure for to secure money in the coffer. He has for sale some negroes male will suit full well grooms. He has likewise some of their wives can make clean dirty rooms. For planting too, he has a few to sell off for the cash. of various price to work the rice or bring them to the lash. The young ones true, if that will do, may some be had of him, to learn your trade they may be made, or bring them to your trim. The boatmen great, will you elate, they're so brisk and free, whatever you say, they will obey, if you buy them of me. He also can suit any man with the land all over the state, a bargain sure they may procure if they don't stay too late. Now, some believe this to be satire. I don't know about that. It seems like he spent a
Seems like a
long
jingle.
time. Yeah,
An advertising jingle.
exactly. That's what it was. I've only got 5 minutes, so next.
Okay, that's the end of the slide. That's the end.
Okay, oh, I didn't add the last one.
Yep, please.
But that's fine. Okay, so many know how awful the treatment of slaves could be after purchase, but no one really talks about how awful the entire process is waiting to be auctioned. They even had some of these slaves run up and down the auction houses to just make sure they're healthy, see how good they are. Being inspected at an auction, being in a slave rearing state, it was also awful, and we don't talk about it quite enough. More about the process can be found in my thesis, and I would like to remind you, if you are uncomfortable, you're meant to be.
Mhm.
And that's, thank you. Other questions?
So you, on an earlier slide, discussed, it was a Jacob Toro?
Yeah,
And he
Judith.
gave- Judith Toro, thank you. And he gave, the woman, the former slave, $4,000. Did you do the currency conversion for that 4,000 in today's money?
Can you repeat the question first?
Oh, yes. So he asked if I did the conversion for the $4,000. I didn't, just because I did the $10,000, but you can go on the US government's website and check that. Yes,
I don't know the exact context of what you were looking at, for your thesis, so this might be out of bounds. Did you notice any change in, again, both Jews not wanting to be vocal about it, or not having, or just like, oh, just be like everyone else kind of pattern, when, the major Central European wave came in the 1850s, so barely 10 years before the war, you have this new wave of fresh immigrants, as opposed to the, third or fourth generation, Americans who had been, especially in the South, the majority of the Jewish population.
okay, so he asked about the wave of the European immigrants, the Jewish European immigrants coming in around the time of the Civil War. So they weren't as well integrated into American society, and those were most likely the people who were a little bit odd about slavery and abhorred it, but they also, some of them went into it even harder. Yeah. Anything? Yes.
I mean, I know it's hard with the sources, but, is there any evidence of what the slaves felt about Jewish slave traders?
There is not many writings, because, a lot of them couldn't read or write, but there is a book, from the early 1800s from here. It's called, Peter Still narrative. It's called, Kidnapped, Ransomed, Redeemed. And he talks about one of his Jewish owners, and he did what Judah Toro did and set him up in business. And he helped provide for this slave's family, helped him marry the girl he was in love with, helped his children. And he paid the fine to have him freed, and actually brought him up to Cincinnati to have the process done. Also, it does not have to be just about what I presented. Yes.
So after Raphael's sermon, so you said there was like, now all of a sudden everybody started giving sermons kind of in one way or the other. How did everybody find out about what he spoke about? Like, what was the dissemination like? It was printed and like sent out all across the country?
Yes, so she asked
Yeah.
how the Bible view of slavery kind of got around in America. And it was printed much like this here, and it was just such a big moment in Jewish history regarding slavery that it just spread by word or by pamphlet. Anything else? Yes.
I'll ask a big awful question. How on earth in the United States redeem what was done to people from?
I don't think there's a way to. I think we just gotta keep moving forward. As it's actually in my conclusion to my thesis, Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. The only thing that has been accomplished since that speech is that Black people can vote. And it's a slow process, but we have to work together and help each other. Also, some states have issued an apology for their laws. Louisiana is the one that, yes, Louisiana. That's the only one that has not issued an apology. So, but it's a slow process, and we all just gotta keep on going. Anything else?
My last act was 3 of my 4 grandparental lineages, were involved in that legal thing,
Yeah.
sadly.
That, and what they did was terrible, but I can't fully judge their character. I wasn't there, and I don't know. I can't ever know who they are, but their actions are awful.
There's also the 1619 project,
Yeah,
Right, yeah, right.
Rabbinical Jones, and they're working on what to do
Yeah.
to address those issues.
Lisa.
So I was wondering, every Pesach, we retell the story of, being freed from slavery, and we press how horrible slavery was. Are there writings that detail, like, how people of this time, like, kind of manage that cognitive dissonance?
Yes, Dr. Rafal, or Rabbi Rafal, it is in the Bible view of slavery. That's how he begins it on why slavery is condoned. He says slavery is in the Bible and that we were slaves once, but that we're people. Sadly.
And that's the general view of how that was the.
Yeah. And they said even heathen slavery, heathens were people. So they didn't even count these people as heathens, which is awful. Anything else? Sorry to leave you with such a terrible subject.
We go from here to lunch.
Yeah. Enjoy.
All right, thank you.
All right.